Many gods were worshipped in Celtic regions of Ireland. These ancient cultures also feared dark spirits and evil creatures. Of all of the feared creatures, vampires were probably feared the most. This was most likely due to most of the people who were feared to have turned into vampires were beloved family members. This made people more hesitant to kill them. There are many stories of funeral rites that would prevent a family member returning as a vampire. These rites could be as simple as placing large stones on the top of the grave, to dismembering the corpse. There are many stories of vampirism in Ireland, and one of the most frightening creatures is known as the Dearg-Due, or Red Thirst. However, the legend of the Dearg-Due is as tragic as it is frightening. Dearg-Due, meaning red blood sucker in Irish, is what this creature came to be called. Although it is supposedly based on a true story, nobody knows the name of this once beautiful woman. In life, over 2,000 years ago, she was a legendary beauty, with blood-red lips and pale blonde hair. Men traveled from far and wide, and even from rival clans across the land, to not only look upon her, but to win her hand. Her outward loveliness was said to be only a shadow of that within her. Godly and kind, she was a blessing to all who knew her. Of course, as fate would have it, this sweet-natured girl fell in love with a local tradesman. He was everything that the young woman wanted in a husband. He was handsome, kind, and was a hard worker. Unfortunately, he had no money. He had no lands, and most importantly, he had nothing to offer the young woman's father in exchange for her hand in marriage. Without money, there was no stature in the community, and without stature, there would be no security for the family. The woman's father would not even consider such a match for his beautiful daughter. Her beauty made her a valuable asset. Instead, the father gave his child to a vastly older, vastly crueler man, all to secure a name and a fortune for the family. While the father reveled in his newly acquired riches, he gave not a thought to his poor daughter. She daily suffered terrible mental and physical abuse at the hands of her new husband. His particular pleasure was found in cutting her with a small knife and watching the dark red blood slowly slide down her delicate porcelain skin. When she was not being abused, she was kept locked away in a tower. Her husband was jealous of other men looking at her, so he kept her locked away in the tower where nobody would ever see her. The young woman was desperate for someone to save her. She held on to the hope that maybe the young tradesman that she had fallen in love with would somehow come and rescue her. She prayed to God every waking moment that she would be saved from the torment that had become her life. That hope kept her alive for many months. After several months of torture, the young woman finally gave up all hope that anyone would come for her. In her desperation to be released from her pain and anguish and loneliness, she decided that she would starve herself to death. She hid the food that was brought to her, and none of the house staff or her husband noticed this. Although she lost weight and looked sickly, the few that saw her believed that she was suffering from some type of minor illness. After weeks of starving herself, she eventually died. Some say the months of abuse had broken and twisted her kind spirit, and before she finally breathed her last breath, she renounced God and vowed a terrible vengeance against not only her cruel husband, but against others that refused to rescue her. She was buried in a small churchyard, near Strongbow's Tree, in the county of Waterford, southeast Ireland. She was allowed to be buried in a churchyard as there was no one that knew that she had actually killed herself. This would have prevented her being buried in hollowed ground. The belief was that the souls of those who commit suicide are never at rest. Regardless, they are, in fact, doomed to walk forever in torment. Long before this sad tale, folklore in Ireland dictated that you should pile stones on the graves of the newly dead, to prevent them from rising again. Perhaps it was out of sadness and guilt that the townspeople did not pile the stones on her grave that first night. Perhaps they remembered the kind and beautiful soul she was and thought she had suffered enough persecution and defamation. They felt guilt as none of them had come to her rescue, despite the fact that they knew her husband was a monster of a man, and none of them had ever seen her again after the day of their marriage. Her undead corpse rose from the earth the very night she was buried, driven by the half-remembered human visions of her own blood welling on her skin, thirsting for revenge, thirsting for blood in return. She rose that night as the Dearg-Due, the red blood drinker, and thus her legend was born. Her first victim was her cruel husband. She crept up on him as he slept. She cut his neck with a knife, and drank the dark red blood as it spilled from his neck. Her next victim was her father, who she called to by making a haunting siren song that lured him outside to her. As she kissed his cheek, she ripped open his face with her fangs, sucking up all of the blood that was spilt, as well as completely draining his body of blood. There are some that say that she repeated this on the young tradesman that she had fallen in love with as punishment for not rescuing her. From that night forward, she would call young men like a siren, tempting them to follow her to her grave, punishing them as she was punished. From then on, Men who went missing or children who died suddenly in the village were all attributed to the cursed, wandering, and insatiable Dearg-Due, the red blood drinker.